Poet Talk, a podcast where poets talk. I'm your poet and host for today. Host poet, a poet with a microphone.
Who gave a poet a microphone?
Why would you give a poet a microphone? Sanna Wani. I'm tuning in from so-called Canada in the city of Takaranto, also known as Toronto, meaning where the trees are standing in the water in Mohawk, who are one of the 6 nations who are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The people of the Longhouse, who with the Anishinaabe formed the 2-row and dish with 1 spoon wampum belt covenants, living treaties that were made between sovereign nations. Where I live and reside is also home to the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Chippewa, the Wendat, and many other Indigenous and Métis peoples. These treaties are reciprocal agreements, living promises which we must all remember and honor, live and abide by as treaty people on this land. This week we're talking about beginnings, and before we begin, I want to introduce you to my lovely friend, future co-host, and guest of honor of this episode, Jody Chan. Jody is a poet, drummer, and organizer based in Toronto. They are the recent author of Impact Statement, out with Break Books this year, and previously published Sick with Black Lawrence Press. I am lucky enough to call them both friend and comrade, and I can confidently say that they are one of the best people I know in the whole world. Just a deeply caring, deeply loving, deeply thoughtful and feeling person with a spicy chaos streak, a Capricorn moon, and a very cute dog named Boba. Welcome, Jody.
Should I introduce you? I didn't read your bio before this, and now I feel like I should, but I am honored to be the guest and future co-host with poet Sanna Wani, famously author of My Grief, the Sun, and many other poems, and leader from and of the heart. I think about this a lot. The word heart forward always comes to mind when I think of you. Golden retriever boyfriend.
Thank you.
Lover and a fighter.
Thank you so much.
Spicy Aries baby. And speaking of beginnings, I remember like 2 years ago when I first went to your book launch in Toronto and heard you read a couple of poems about friendship, and I thought, I must be this person's friend. And here we are 2 years later. I successfully schemed my way into this friendship and into this podcast. So
I feel like
sorry
I've been
to everyone,
scheming.
but yeah.
I've been scheming for months. I think we can really get into the origin of all of this, which is when I was at dinner at your home and your partner, Myung-sun, said, "You two, you're funny."
And we were like, why, thank you. Yes, I agree.
But really, that was it. I was like, okay, one person thinks we're funny. Let's make it happen. Let's make it happen.
From one to the world.
From one to... So why did you agree to do this podcast with me?
Great question. Yeah, I think 2 things were coming to mind for me. One is that kind of in this moment, like, I think we've been friends for like a year or so now, but for me it really feels like it was in like October or November of last year, during this moment of Israel's like ongoing genocide in Palestine, that we started organizing this event together, like Writers for Palestine, that had come through like your relationships and your network, and came to this like, it's like budding collective, Daybreak Poets Collective that we're in. It's like anti-imperialist poets collective. So we kind of just been like slowly building trust and relationship, feel like with each other separately as friends, but then also within this collective. And that really, I don't know, I think like cemented a level of like trust or like integrity being our keyword of 2024.
Integrity is our word of the year. Yeah. Just like Kylie Jenner's realization, the year of integrity.
Yeah, exactly. But like working, I feel like for me, like my love language is like collaboration or like working with people on things. And so yeah, just thinking about how relationships are so important to organizing, and yeah, I don't know, in the months since then, we've been like doing a bunch of organizing also with other like writers and artists and cultural workers, and sort of both feeling like, yeah, the collective power and potential of like seeing ourselves like in solidarity with each other like this, and like demanding things of our organizations and institutions in a way that I think is like not often part of the collective consciousness of like writers and artists, but that really leans on relationships. It's like you got to do things with people, and so you have to have like real relationships of like care and trust to a certain extent. And yeah, I was thinking also about like Christina Sharp's definition in Ordinary Notes of care as like shared risk. So yeah, I think all of this kind of made me feel like I want to have more relationships with poets. Like I want to actually be able to like organize with poets and build power with poets, and but to do that in a real kind of, yeah, a real like relational way where we care about each other and get to know each other, and have these spaces too that are not like we're sitting down in a meeting trying to like do something in the next 90 minutes, but we have some space to actually like talk about our practice too. Yeah, I'm like, in the end, we have chosen to be poets. Like we've decided that like poetry, I guess I've decided that poetry is like one of the tools that I'm going to use like in collective struggle or like in this work. And so always noodling on like, well, what is it that poetry can do? What is it that poetry can't do? And it's like not a question that can be answered in isolation from other people. So yeah, I just want to talk to people about the things I'm thinking about, basically. Yeah, selfishly.
Selfishly and selflessly, both, maybe both, because it is I don't know, a lot of thoughts are echoing in my brain in response, one of which is I've always thought that conversations feel like a well. Like conversations are often a place, like a small place to dig really deep into, that do a lot of work, that like invisible work that I think is necessary and is like so important for all aspects of life, for like interpersonal like relationships, but also for larger organizing mandates or initiatives, like the kind of trust work, the kind of everyday sort of like connection work. And then I wanted to ask you, as you mentioned, that poetry feels like an important part of the project. Why? This was a question I had for later. But, you know, we've talked about this before, but like, what is important about the label of a poet? Like, what is important about the word that signifies the being of a poet, that I think both of us have said? Like, it's important to me when I introduce myself that I say that I'm a poet. And I haven't, like, that, it's like a long question that I think I'll answer like for the rest of my life. But in this moment, when you introduce yourself to someone as a poet, why do you do that?
Well, in this moment, I'm going to resort to the age-old technique of turning the question back on you. I will answer the question also, but now that you've brought it up, I'm curious, why
do I?
Yeah, like when you say it's important to you to introduce yourself as a poet. Yeah.
And given the fact that we named this Poet Talk, Poets Who Talk, Talking Poets, etc.
Poets with microphones.
Poet with a microphone. Who gave a poet a microphone? I think I do that because I think poetry has been like laden with a meaning that among the people that I respect and run with, I feel deeply attached to. So there is a world where maybe I would cringe at the idea of introducing myself as a poet, but because of the people and the poets that I've loved and learned to love, it's a label. Not a label. It's not even a label. What is it? It's like a practice. It's like a way of life almost. Like a religion. Like it means a lot to me in the same way as those things I think mean a lot to people. Like it's the same as calling myself Muslim. It's the same as calling myself Kashmiri. It feels like a country that I come from. That was stealing Yanyi. I stole that from Yanyi, I have to confess. Remember at the end of one, it's like, womanhood is the country I come from.
Yeah.
That was completely, I just paraphrased that. But it really does feel that way. It feels like an array of being that was a gift, that was gifted to me by the people I encountered. And it's not to say that it's not fallible and that it's not vulnerable or that it's somehow, you know, this like, I don't want to make it like sui generis. I don't want to make it like beyond. It's very of the earth. It's very like in our hands, but I'm attached to it, deeply attached to it for the things it's brought into my life, even the people like you.
Oh, what a nice answer. Yeah, because I'm hearing also that poet, like, not so much as a, like, it's not a nationalist identity in that way, but it's about situating yourself in part, like, amongst people that you respect and care about, admire, who also are poets or who call themselves poets or for whom poetry is a practice. Yeah, I think
my community. It's like it's the community that I think I've cultivated the most intentionally in my life.
You're choosing to be in and of this community by calling yourself a poet.
Yeah, which is why Daybreak also means so much, because it feels like a culmination of that work. Because I think the poets I align with are the poets who hear the word poetry as like synonymous with politics, who hear the word poetry and who think of like a way of feeling or a way of being in the world that is pressed up against like our convictions about how that is meant to be, like how that power is meant to be used, or how that power manifests, like a deep, deep clarity maybe about the power that is like trailing behind the word poetry. Salma Sharif, hello. She's already here.
We are not personal friends, just to clarify.
We just love her and think of her voice like a ghost that follows us. At least I do. But the essay, what is it called? The essay on erasure. The beginning of it has something very beautiful that's said about poetry and power, and where she's like in that scene where she's washing the dishes.
Yes, everything is about power.
Yeah.
Yeah, like thinking about her work and how she often talks about form as an enactment or a manifestation of power, and how it acts on language, how it shapes or constrains. And so thinking about form and power as like a practice together. Yeah, I think when you said like the people that you connect to as poets are people who see poetry as synonymous with politics, and also makes me think of like poetry for me maybe is where like language really touches the world in like the most direct way. And by touching the world, obviously, like touching power relations, touching these systems, touching the ways that we're in relationship and live alongside each other. So like touching solidarity, like that all of these things are bound up in the practice of like poetry as a way of using language, or like making and like wrestling with language directly. Yeah, there's something very immediate and lived and like felt about poetry as a way of like being with language.
And so that's part of why the introduction feels important.
Yeah, there's like an ethics that for me feels like bound up, which I think is like hard to put language to, but I think that's part of what poetry is for me too. It's like the way,
an ethical commitment.
Yeah, it's an ethical commitment, and it's actually the way that I think. Like I don't know, I like read a lot of theory, or like could maybe regurgitate a lot of theory, but on the level of the body, like where it actually becomes something that I can live, or something that I can put in practice in spaces, like with other people, in organizing and movement spaces, or like in a day-to-day kind of space. Like I have to like feel it first, and poetry maybe is the space that like mediates that for me, that turns it from something that I can think into something that I have felt.
I think it's very good at being between those spaces, because I was describing once the other day that I have come to understand poetry as like a category of feeling. It's like somewhere between feeling, thinking, understanding. It, I think, makes that it is very capable of like playing in just the like in the space of being, or like connecting us to a more embodied, a more mindful, a more like present. It's presence and poetry also come to mind when thinking.
Wait, I have one more thought.
Yeah, tell me.
Okay. well, because I'm thinking about what you said of how like being a poet positions you in relation to all these other people. I think that's part of it too, like that ecosystem or like collective is so much a part of the practice of poetry for me. Like no single poem is ever going to contain everything. I think it was an interview that Zaina Al-Sus did with the Adroit Journal at some point where she talked about that, like each poem is an attempt and even each book is an attempt, and it just kind of becomes part of this constellation of other people who are similarly making efforts towards the same thing that I think is so beautiful about poetry, because the form kind of dictates that, like, you know, yeah, each poem can only hold so much. And I know you have opinions about this also. Like,
I do. Wait, just remind me, my goldfish era.
Oh, well, I think one time you were talking about like, oh, I think a poem like kind of comes out, and to a certain extent, it just like is what it is, and you can only edit it so far. But fiction is different in that way. So
the whole convo about shooting an arrow versus kneading the bread. This was like, this came out of I think it comes down to poetry doing something with language that like you said presses up against the world. Like it feels to us, maybe to those of us who are poets, it feels like the closest place to get, or like touching, attempting to press your whole heart, body, mind.
And our friend of the podcast, Bahar Aram, in her brilliant book Where Things Touch on Beauty, makes me think of that. Sanna's having a moment.
I whispered my Bible.
I mean, same.
Yeah.
I mean, same. But yeah, one part where she writes about beauty, if you're lucky, means there's like more of you, like more surface to press against the earth. Right? So yeah, something going on with poetry and beauty and language and feeling.
Yeah.
That feels very distinct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen that meme that's like the 1-bedroom apartment, all utilities? It's like an ad in a newspaper for an apartment.
No.
And it was going viral, I think on Twitter, a couple of years ago, because in red circled, instead of writing no pets, he wrote no poets. No poets, no smoking, available July 1st. And I thought that's also an important in the archive of poetry.
Yeah, that's good poet lore.
That's good poet lore, I think. Yeah. And it's important to be a little bit self-deprecating as a poet.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
it's a little.
Acknowledge just like how truly embarrassing it is to be a poet.
How truly embarrassing it is. It's so true. Maybe we could go to the back. Go to the back. Go to the beginning again. And I just wanted to add more to the conversation of why we were doing this or how we began, and think more about that together. Because in all honesty, also, I love your answer, but I think mine is very different, in the sense that I think that I've been thinking about doing this for a really long while, and kind of a little bit disconnected from community. More, I don't know, in this realm of cyberspace, the VS podcast meant so much to me when I was like growing up as a poet. Like, I feel like it really taught me what it means to be a poet. And I feel like since Brittany Rogers and Ajni Dawkins made the move of solidarity to basically pause or leave VS in November 2023. And I feel like for a while there's just been like a gap in kind of that space. And then I think I've just been in a place where I've been thinking a lot about myself as like not just a writer, but like now having gotten a certain amount of like grip on my writing and feeling quite confident and secure in where my writing is, and that train feels like it's going, like that railway feels like it's running, and turning my attention more towards like community building aspects and like how I want to start things that will inevitably probably end, but in the transitional cycles of efforts made towards like magazines, podcasts, all of the different things we make together, right? That we collaborate on, like you said. And this was something that I knew that I wanted to do.
What you said about just now that you are, I don't know, established or just like running with poetry or as a poet, that the next question that you turn to is like, how do I build community, or how do I, like, what does this look like in relationship with other people? Is I think why I admire and also respect your practice so much, because I think that's really beautiful and like not actually something we're like trained to do as artists, like in a capitalist system that wants you to sort of just pursue an idea of stay in line, pursue like individual success or recognition, like without actually considering the people around you, behind you, beside you. So yeah, I love that.
Thanks. I just want the baby poets to have a podcast so they can figure out themselves as poets too.
The word that came to mind is poet doula.
Oh my god!
Because I'm in training to be a death doula and doing end of life care and grief care work, and we're always talking about like companioning, the idea of like presence, like you're saying, presence being such a big part of poetry, presence being such a big part of grief and death work. But yeah, this idea of like being a companion and just like moving beside someone as they are like having their own experience and journey of this, like. Just had this image of you like bopping beside the baby poet as they're figuring out who they are in the world and like what they
That's so, thank you
what a
for
perfect companion
that. Oh,
you would be. You
thanks.
are.
So maybe I want to transition us to thinking about beginnings in a different way now, and I want to start by sharing the etymology of the word begin. According to the online etymology dictionary, the noun beginning is from the late 12th century, a time when something begins. The initial stage or first part, the verbal noun of begin. The meaning act of starting something is from the early 13th century, and the Old English word was actually fruma, which is where foremost comes from, which explains the former latter cultural catastrophe in English, because nobody, do you know when someone says the former or the latter? I still don't know what is being said, because former means beginning, even though now former kind of means the later. But the verb came from Old English, to attempt, to undertake, and from West Germanic, genan, which was found in compounds, obscure compounds, but loosely perhaps means to open or to open up. And I liked finding out all of that because there's a sense of evolution between the sense of opening to beginning.
Do you want to say more about that? Like what is moving from opening to beginning?
I think I like the idea of beginning being an opening, or like materially in the word begin there is some kind of opening, like almost like a hole to crawl through.
It feels less linear, like it's not beginning as like setting you in one specific direction, or that it's like chronologically from beginning to end, but just opening could be in any direction, any dimension.
Maybe we can move along to the first few curated lines of poems. And I know that you brought one, Jody. Do you want to share it?
When you said first lines of poetry, the first line that came to mind was the first line from Solmaz Sharif's debut collection, Look. It matters what you call a thing. And I think I remembered one interview that I watched that she did where she talked about just how much intention she put into that line, thinking of it not just as the first line of this poem, but the first line of this poem of this first book of many books that form a career or like a life's work or whatever you want to call it. And I remember just like, well, first of all, being like, you're on another level as a human being that I will never reach.
So true. So true. The wow, the thoughtfulness.
Yeah.
Wow.
And also the confidence in a way, like this is the first book of many and this is not the only thing I will have to say. And how do I want to open, like you're saying, the the etymology of beginning and opening. How do I open this engagement with the world? And what is it that I would want to say to do that? It's kind of mind-blowing to me. And that the thing that she said was, it matters what you call a thing. Such like a declarative statement about her poetics also. About a poetics that engages with power, and that engages with politics and form.
And with like mattering.
Yeah, that kind of like rejects the, when people say like, oh, poetry doesn't make anything happen, kind of rejects that in a way, like that there is something that poetry can act on, and it is like part of our responsibility maybe as poets to like reckon honestly with like what that is at all times. Maybe it's changing in different moments and in different contexts, but yeah, that it does matter. And so calling into the room all of these like ethical commitments as poets, wow, powerful power move,
like another level. Truly another level. And reminding me also of what I love, you quoted this once and I think of it often, her another poem, maybe the same poem, I don't know, but that like is the cruelest word, and that you can use it to compare two things that are deeply dissimilar. You can use it to defang something that is powerful. You can use it to bolster something that is not powerful or that is very weak. And just that kind of through line in her work, right? Which is a through line that I admire so deeply, of like almost taking the pieces apart. She's quite mechanical, I find. There's almost like an engineering quality, kind of like tenderness, and also like a deep commitment that is required in how you touch like those pieces. And I feel like Sharif does that with words. Like she treats them with the same kind of like preciousness of part. The poetry beginning that I brought forward from my heart was actually Fatimah Asghar's poem, Kal. And the first line of it goes, Allah, you gave us language where yesterday and tomorrow are the same word, Kal. I just return to this poem like so often. And as I was thinking about like what beginning I wanted to bring forward here, yesterday and tomorrow, beginnings and endings tied up together again and again, as we'll continue to see, and kal as a kind of word reverberating between them, a word that's like truly enamored with their mirroring, in the sense of like a beginning mirroring an ending, a beginning as the opening, kind of a gap, right? Like a crevice. And I don't know, I just wanted to, again, we're bringing our ghosts and our beloveds into the room, our beloved ghosts, let's call them. And Fatih is definitely one of them for me. And this poem is like a friend that I've leaned on to, for sure, time and time again.
Was this poem a beginning for you of anything?
I think so. You know how we've been talking about how like poetry is a sense of feeling? Or when you write, do you feel overcome by a feeling, or do you feel inspired, or do you just have something? Like, what is the experience of beginning a poem for you?
Sort of like a non-specific feeling, I think. Like, it's not something where I could put a label on it and say what I'm feeling right now is grief. Not that grief is a feeling too, but like an experience of many feelings. But yeah, that it's not like one feeling that I could name, but just like maybe like an oversaturation of feeling in a way that maybe coalesces in like one line or one image, and then I get hooked into it, and I just kind of have to open up that image, or open up this word or this idea for construction. Like sometimes that's what comes to. It's like not that deep, but like what if I were to write a poem that like uses mostly words that have these like 3 shared sounds or something. So like like an instruction, for building.
To unpack.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful.
Yeah. What about you?
I ask because I think there is a feeling I've come to recognize as poetry. Like there's a feeling that I call poetry, or a poetry that calls itself a feel. I don't know, something like that. And I can remember very clearly that every time I read this poem, Gal, I can find it. Like it's like almost like a compass. Like I can remember the feeling that I call poetry, particularly by the end of the poem. And I think just so many of its themes, like grief, mothering, time, or a kind of release of time, the time-space continuum, to find something else, to open our way into something else, that I think they do so beautifully with this particular work. So yeah, I usually begin a poem by becoming aware, or the feeling coming over me, of poetry, and I'm like, oh, like it's a poem coming. It's like catching something. Like it usually is. And sometimes it has early stages, like the feeling of the poem comes over me very slowly, but sometimes it's very intense and very coalesced and almost like tight in the feeling. And usually when I read a poem I really love, it's a much faster and clearer process. And yeah, a compass. I think this poem is definitely a compass for that feeling.
A compass for feeling. I love that. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and it's making me think back to the line that I brought in, and I feel like I cut off the rest of that line. Like, it matters what you call a thing exquisite. A lover called me exquisite, and I think as a compass too for feeling, and also like what a poem can hold. Like some of the themes, maybe in the same way that you're talking about how like some of the themes in Fatimah Asghar's like work also resonate with themes that you are often like spending time with, like in your own work. Like, yeah, I think same for me with that poem of just like, yeah, like the beloved, like touch, intimacy, empire, power, language, like that all of those can coexist in this like kind of compressed space and time of a poem, that there is a very immediate like catching of that feeling that happens, and it's like from the moment that first line begins.
I feel led inevitably, and as I did my research, I felt led inevitably to the question too of like, what is the beginning of poetry? Since we're talking about beginnings, I did a bunch of different research, but I think I was really taken with the idea that poetry in many ways, one, predates literacy and has a deep connection to oral history. Like it's a device of memory. It was often an object of memory before it was an object of aesthetic. There was something I read about how there was only really a distinction made between poetry and poetics. Poetics being the study of aesthetic in poetry around like, I don't know, like Sophocles or something. But who knows how we track history, right? I'm sure there was somebody who was thinking about the beauty of their language long before that. Mm-hmm. But I really was taken by the idea of poetry in its oral sense being this like very ancient tool, as well as art. When we talk about the beginning of poetry, maybe what we really mean is the beginning of lyric poetry, which I believe both of us ostensibly write in, and which is the most generalized category of poetry in the world now, the most popular. And lyric poetry originates in the late 19th century, modern lyric poetry being a formal type of poetry which expresses personal emotions or feelings, quote unquote. It owes its temperament in many ways to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who developed the categories of lyrical, dramatic, and epic poetry. It's colored in this way by many Western modernist myths, traditions, fractures, and fumblings. You know, poets love to quote the etymology of poetry itself, I think, which comes from the Greek poiesis, meaning to make, to produce, to compose, and tracing it further back to the Proto-Hellenic poios, from Proto-Indo-European, I cannot say this. I'll put it in like the description. Quoy, which really leads us to pile, stow, and gather together. So I found that really cool.
Mm-hmm.
just as as a pin to put in the ground of when we think about the beginning of poetry.
Mm-hmm. Pile, stow, and gather.
Pile, stow, and gather.
As a way of making too is interesting. Yeah.
But this reminds me too that we are speaking to one another in English, often writing in English or thinking in English, but I don't ever want to forget to bring other languages in. Maybe that's also why I'm so fixated on Kal. I'm always longing for the poetry of Urdu, which I try to access, and I've been trying to more and more. But I just want to make sure we bring in other languages, and I think a cool way we could do that to loosen English's power on us, even just a touch, is through etymology again. So I had the idea that we could bring in a word of poetry, a word meaning poetry that is close to both of us in another language that we know, and to follow their paths in time as well. Mm. So my word is shairi in Urdu, which is the same as it is in Kashmiri in Urdu, but not in Hindi. Usually I can't tell the difference between Hindi and Urdu, but this was one time. I guess in their most formal forms, they do tend to diverge, because the word in Hindi is kavita, which is very different. It has a very different, deep, intense history. But shairi in Urdu is born from the classical Farsi sair, meaning a poet, or like someone who does poetry, or sairi, meaning the art of poetry, which then comes from the Arabic shair, to know, to realize, to feel, to be aware. Too many words for me to really say that there's an encompassing feeling knowing, which involves the heart demand, which we were kind of talking about earlier too. And finally, interestingly, it all comes from the Arabic trio root. So there's many words in Arabic that come from clusters of words that come from 3 letters. And in this case, it's sheen, ayn, and ra. Which all often relate to words that have to do with knowledge, awareness, or hair. Hair. At several points in my research of this specific word, it seemed that words about poetry were just like one step away from words about hair, bristles, furriness, or pelt, cracks or strains like hairline fractures in a vase, or strands of hair.
I like this inventory of images that are kind of compiling now around like piling, stowing, gathering, fractures, like, and then hair and hairline fracture. To me, I'm like, oh, that's an expression that I know in English, but that imagery also kind of persists in a different etymology.
Mm-hmm. I liked the simultaneous, like in the Urdu / Arabic / Persian word, the thickness, to put it quite simply, to reduce it down to its parts, but just to have one thing that when compiled makes this one larger thing that looks as if it's a monolith, but is really many'd. Anyway, that is the origin of the word in Urdu.
Okay, so I too have a word, although my etymology is much more loosey-goosey. I did not do any research, so this is all hearsay.
I love hearsay and rumors.
This is all gossip. This is all poetry gossip. So the word for poetry in Cantonese that I know is si. And so I think I don't often encounter it separate from verb. So what are the actions that you would take in relation to poetry or in relation to si? And one is lim si. So kind of memorizing poetry or reciting poetry. And to me, it's interesting that the verb and the noun go so closely together. But the character for poetry, for si, what I know of it, is that it has a couple of different parts, and often characters will have different parts, some that are phonetic and that tell you how to say that character, and some that are semantic and that kind of give some clue as to what the meaning of the word is. And so part of the semantic unit of this character, I guess, is the character in itself for speech, but with a little marking added to it that indicates sort of the mouth, or the tongue and the mouth, and that kind of suggests this grasping or holding of speech, or movement of speech through the mouth. then there's like a phonetic part kind of the character too. But so that's what I know of that character, and what poetry as language or speech kind of held in the mouth, which I appreciate for like the embodied like nature of that. But I have a story to tell you about this character, which is that so when I was born and my parents were trying to give me my like Cantonese name, and they're like mulling over possibilities, and I think hadn't decided on anything yet. And then my mom died a week after I was born, and this, for whatever reason, sparked my dad to have a moment of thinking that he should name me Leem or something like that. So the character for reciting or memorizing, because it's also not just memorizing poetry, but that verb in another context could also be about grieving or holding, memorializing, all of these sorts of connotations. So to him, he was kind of trying to capture in my name this quality of like grieving or mourning my mom. And thankfully someone talked him out of it, because I think it was my mom's sister actually. Yeah. She was like, that's kind of like a lot for like a baby.
They were just born.
Like, you're kind of like defining their destiny for like the rest of their life, and to be named under, I don't know, like the star of grief or whatever.
Yeah.
But
to be named under the star of grief.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to repeat that.
Now we're just staring at each other. But yeah, exactly. Imagine giving that to a baby.
And then just staring at the baby. Wow.
But I like this story because, it just makes me feel like I had an affinity with poetry and with grief. And it makes sense for me too, that so much of my poetry is kind of like steeped in grief or exploring grief. And it actually made it into my first poem of my first book as well.
Nice.
So
I was gonna ask, does it feel like an origin? Does it feel like a beginning?
Yeah.
That you like to return to?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. It's very beautiful.
So, yeah.
But thank God for your aunt.
Thank God. Yeah.
That would have been so much. In Urdu, we have there's this saying that sometimes when babies get sick, when they're really small, like people avoid when people give babies names with like a heavy consonant. So like, let me give an example. Hawa, like Hawa would be considered a heavy name. And if the baby was given the name Hawa and then got sick, they would change the baby's name. Because
Why?
they would be like, naam bhari pad gaya. Like their name is too heavy on them.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's like
the sickness is their body like rejecting the heaviness of the name.
The heaviness of the name. Like particularly the like ha or ain, like those consonants are like considered heavy.
And like heavy in what sense? Like what is that?
Yeah, it's hard to describe.
Like burdensome, or
just like a very difficult. It's almost like a very open noun. It's like often nouns that make the shape of an O with your mouth. Openings again.
Openings.
Yeah, I just remembered that though. So I feel like that would be a case of naam bhari pad gaya, like giving that kind of, because sometimes it can be also if you name like a baby another like special person's name, you could be like, that name was too heavy for them. The memory was too heavy.
The memory was too heavy. Also.
The memory was too heavy.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of etymology is like this. Like when you really spend time with where a word came from and how it traveled, like a lot of that history is so
like myth, like myth making.
Yeah.
My next point for us to talk about was just to marvel for a second at how often beginnings and endings appear together. What's up with that?
What's up with like, are you upset by it?
I'm just like, oh, like that's pretty interesting. I don't know. I'm very into synchronicity because of Julia Cameron. I'm doing The Artist's Way. This will probably come up. It comes up every single time I talk to Jody, or if I look at anybody, I'm fucking talking about Julia Cameron again. So embarrassing. But I really do. I feel like I've been believing more and more in like the universe's patterns. And I think one of the maybe things I learned as I was researching was, beginnings and endings, they sit side by side wherever they go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As someone who is obsessed with death and loves talking about death and is trying to
talk it,
make my life about death.
Yeah.
No, I'm with you. Yeah. Shut up. Beginnings and endings going together.
Shut up.
But yeah, like death is the ultimate opening in a way. Like there's no way to know, and you just have to get there and find out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Selfishly, tell me more. About, I don't know, I'm just like about the idea of death being an opening, or your own affinity you've mentioned, right, like so far, to death or to grief, death, dulying, companioning, we said earlier. And now it feels perfectly aligned with this idea of beginning, ending, touching.
I guess one thing is that when I think about death, that it can be such a moment of like coalescing, of like people coming together. Or when I think about this idea of like what is a good death to me, or what is a death that I would want if I could choose. And obviously most people don't get to decide what are the circumstances under which they die, but like surrounded by loved ones, or like in a position where I have had the space to reflect on like what was important to me in life, and like what I did, and what my relationships were, and what people meant to me, and what I meant to them, and all of that it's such a gathering. And maybe thinking back to like pile stowing and gathering as a beginning of poetry, that feels like a lot of how I would want to like live my end, or like my death. But then also like, this question of like what happens after you die, that there's no way to really answer that. We could have like beliefs about it, but it is like the true space of unknowing.
Yeah, the truest space of unknowing in some sense. Which also makes me think, that's why poetry loves it, or that's why poetry like gathers near it like a moth, because of poetry's love of...
Poetry loves unknowing.
Poetry loves unknowing. Poetry loves the void. I think so.
So true.
Poetry does love the void. And this also reminded me of, I don't think we've ever discussed this even as friends, but both of us, I think, share... Because my book is titled My Grief the Sun. So kind of almost in like a lovely mirrored sense, my affinity to grief comes from, I think, its ability to like shed light on life. Like when something passes away, something else almost like opens to become brighter, or to outline, or to thread, like to thread a memory there, or to thread a poem there, has often felt like easier in many ways, just because it's so charged, right? Like I think there are zones in life, or in the world, or in our experiences of the world, that are just charged with things poetry likes. Like, again, with that moth metaphor, like
that poetry hovers around.
That poetry is
death.
The ghost, yeah. Poetry really does, I think, hover around death, or around grief also.
I like this idea of like being able to thread a poem. So like through the space of unknowing, or like around it, or
maybe around it. Maybe to make an outline of it in whatever way we can, in the dimensions we have access to. I like this image now of poetry as the moth.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I think for me too, with like poetry and death, like it also has a lot to do with like madness and my own experience around that, and with like suicidality and stuff, like just spending so much of life kind of touching death, or the possibility of death, like really saying, hello, how are you? Like every single day. And that, like, I often have thought about poetry as a way of like translating madness, or like holding that in a way that it's like untranslatable into kind of like quote unquote like coherent or linear or whatever language, that those things are touching also for me all the time.
Wow. I love two thoughts. One, I love that this is becoming like our Ars Poetica. We're like, so what do Jody and Sanna think poetry is? I think that's perfect. No, truly, I think that's perfect. And I'm also thinking that I want to share. One time in university, I did like a final paper as a series of poems, erasure poems, that are actually like the second section of the book. That's eventually what they became, but they started out a little bit different. And in the comments that my professor gave me, Professor Mittermeier wrote, she made something apparent that I've thought about a lot since, which is that I sometimes talk about poetry as something I'm not doing. Like it's very Sufi of me also, because she specialized, her anthropology often followed people who were Sufi in Egypt in acting in like non-agentival ways, like acting out of their body or out of body experiences that happened in those kind of religious spaces. And she felt, I think, an affinity between how I talked about poetry and those kinds of Sufi beliefs, like that God is something that acts through you, or like this idea that, you know, I didn't write the poem, I almost like carved it out. It revealed itself to me. I think I had written in my reflective paper or something like that. And she was like, that's real Sufi of you. And I hold on to that deeply because I think it is a real, I was just reminded of it when you were talking, because I think I've often felt like writing or poetry is something that I summon, but that is not mine. Like a real sense that like there is a poetry out there and I catch it. But I don't, like, it's not material I've made.
Like kind of
I'm
taking
holding,
with this like,
this, like
catching
I'm
motion.
doing a hand
But
motion.
also that earlier you were talking about feeling as something you catch too, like when you're reading a poem, or like that's the impulse, maybe starting impulse for poetry sometimes is like catching a feeling. Maybe what it's bringing to mind for me is just like not shying away from like the spiritual elements of like poetry too, and that of also grief and death and like all these experiences that are in some way like too big for like the flesh vessel, my little meat suit here to hold, that there is something.
Me and my little meat suit.
Just me and my meat suit.
And that's maybe why I love Julia Cameron these days, because I just love that she's brought me back after a long period of like spiritual drought. She's brought me back to this idea that creativity is deeply spiritual. Like there is something that wants to happen. Like there is something that desires to be created or likes that you engage with it or that you create in it. And I found I'm enamored by that possibility. I've always been enamored by it, but I'm now enamored by her because I'm enamored by the reminder and the kind of expansiveness she gives that. She gets a little too gaudy often, both G-O-D-Y, but also gaudy, like G-A-U-D-Y. Tacky girl. But I love tackiness, and I love Julia.
Like how quickly it went from spirituality to tackiness.
I wanted to end this episode by talking about another beginning. Because as we record, thousands of students across Turtle Island are gathering, boycotting, and protesting against various academic institutions invested in Israel and in arms manufacturers who are contributing to, the genocide ongoing in Palestine. These students are demanding that their institutions divest and setting an example for all of us on what it means to imagine a new world, to begin a new world. I bring this up because also synchronously, in a stroke of serendipity, when we visited the encampment, we saw a sign that someone had hung up at the University of Toronto's encampment named the People's Circle for Palestine, and it was a quote by Fatimah Asghar, which said, "The only thing in the world worth beginning, the end of the world, of course." And that was from the Notebook of a Return to the Native Land.
Yeah, and I brought a quote to share in relation to that, because hearing that the only thing worth beginning is the end of the world. And it brought to mind this like saying around abolition that I think we hear a lot, or I hear a lot of, like, abolition is the end of the world. And so this quote from Harney and Moten, the Undercommons, they write, "What is, so to speak, the object of abolition? Not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have the wage. And therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society." And so all this that we've been talking about of beginnings and endings touching the end of the world, meaning the founding of a new society. And it makes me think too of these encampments as like one tactic in a much wider struggle against settler colonialism and against imperialism worldwide, and a fight not only for divestment and for the dismantling of these institutions and these systems that are profiting and investing in the arms trade, but the end of a world in which settler colonialism could even be a structure that exists. So it is one tactic and part of a fight that is much bigger than that. And I think too, Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism, wrote a spicy line about how liberals are the foot soldiers of colonialism. So true, and maybe so true, bestie. But made me think too about how these encampments like expose that logic around liberalism and really force it to confront the logics of capitalism and of imperialism, and how we're like not supposed to just like exist in space and live together and like take care of each other. And to bring in one last quote.
Yeah, please.
I was remembering in The End of White Supremacy, Saidiya Hartman said, "Is abolition just a synonym for love?" And so, it makes me think about all of this beginnings and endings of worlds, and how is that a synonym for love? And also, I want to reclaim love from like liberalism. I feel like there's all this like light and love discourse that kind of made love seem like this kind of frivolous or like placating, like
defanged love.
Exactly. And I think the liberals shouldn't get to have love.
No,
we should take it back.
Actually, thank you. It's ours. It reminds me too of one time, I think in the Versus episode of where they interviewed Fatih. They said, like, I like what they think about love, which feels very aligned with this. And it's like, I want everything I do to begin and end with love. But they don't mean like a love that is like, la-di-da, warm feeling inside my heart. It's like a love as like an ethical commitment, like a practice, like a commitment to one another, a kind of care, a kind of depth of care even. I feel like you embody that a lot. I was discussing this with my cousin, because I was just discussing the possibility of a different world, and we were like, well, if the world ends, maybe we can, I don't know, none of us should lock our doors. And she was like, what? And I was like, it could be. But anyway, you got brought up because I was like, there are people around me who practice a level of care and who are building a level of trust with each other where we could live that way.
Yeah, but there has been another way, and there can and will be, actually.
There can
another
and
world.
will be.
Yeah.
There will be, yeah.
Yeah, so is poetry just how we practice loving the world?
Wow. Is poetry just how we practice loving the world? To end our episode, Jody, I'd like to invite you to share your favorite poem on beginnings, and maybe tell us why you brought this specific poem.
So the poem I brought is called "Tomorrow is a Place" by my favorite poet, Sanna Wani. Oh my god. I've just been waiting to inflict this on you, actually. I'm like so happy about this. I'm so sorry.
I literally
Sanna is levitating off the chair right now. In like pain or in happiness, I can't tell.
Perhaps both.
I can't tell.
Perhaps both. That is very kind of you. That was like, that's the true ghost of today. Being confronted by your own poem.
Should I read it?
Sure.
Tomorrow is a place for Maya. We meet at a coffee shop. So much time has passed, and who is time? Who is waiting by the windowsill? We make plans to go to a museum, but we go to a bookshop instead. We're leaning in, learning how to talk to each other again. I say, I'm obsessed with my grief, and she says, I'm always in mourning. She laughs, and it's an extension of her body. She laughs, and it moves the whole room. I say, my home is an extension of my body, and she says, most days are better with a long walk. The world moves without us, so we tend to a garden, a graveyard, a pot on the windowsill. Death is a comfort because it says, transform but don't hurry. There is a tenderness to growing older, and we are listening for it. Steadier ways to move through the world, and we are learning them. A way to touch your own body. A touch that says, dig deeper. There in the ground, there is our memory. I am near enough my roots. Time is my friend. Tomorrow is a place we are together.
That made me very emotional to hear you read it. Did you share about why? Sorry, I blacked out there.
Because I love my friend.
So true.
And I love this poem.
Jody is also wearing a shirt at the moment that says, I love my friends.
It's true. I'm very consistent. But also I think, and at the end of our conversation, I feel like it couldn't have been more perfect, all the things that we talked about and that this poem holds, like, death and grief, of course. And it made me remember our first conversation that we ever had, where we also talked about so much grief and estrangement and death of, like, parts of the self or, like, past relationships and all of this. And but how this poem, for me, the feeling that I catch when I read it is so much opening and beginning. And so, it feels very fitting that it reminds me of that beginning of our friendship, and that there is also so much of that feeling in the relationship in this poem. And how it moves so, like, carefully and lovingly.
It's so nice that you brought it, and that you're bringing it into conversation in this way too, because I'm thinking about Maya was an old friend who I hadn't seen for 5 years when I wrote it. And it's like an odd little instance of a beginning and an ending, right? Because we were beginning, like, this new chapter of our friendship, but we were also ending or reflecting on the ending of an old chapter. So it exists, I think, in that space. That is no space, that time, that is no time. It's just your friend that you're happy to see again.
And there's so much, like, permission and, like, love in the tomorrow is a place we are together. Like, it's not saying how close are we together, in what way are we together, but just regardless of what it actually looks like, that there's the togetherness exists and, like, the love and care. And that is something that can count on.
Thanks for listening to this pilot episode on beginnings. If you liked this episode, I encourage you to share it with poet and non-poet friends alike, and to please leave a review, comment, or rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Don't forget to click that follow button too, so you don't miss our next episode with the amazing Palestinian-American poet Samer Farha. Poet Talk is produced and created by me, Sanna Wani. The show music includes songs from the album Elise's Awesome Dance Adventure by Komiku, including Elise's theme as the intro and a calm moment to remember before taking the dangerous road as the outro. The transitional music is An Anarchist Utopia and that weird feeling when you understand that you are alone and the only hope. You can learn more about Komiku at loyaltyfreakmusic.com. Special thanks to Jody Chan for their contributions to this and future episodes. For more information and to support Poet Talk, you can visit our website, poettalk.buzzsprout.com, or follow us on our Instagram @talkpoet. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks again for listening. Bye.